Let me introduce myself. I'm Josh Pasek. I'm one of the associate directors for the Michigan Institute for Data Science, and I'm sort of the associate director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science that's a little bit more tasked toward the social sciences and also in practice the humanities. So I am in the communication and media department, and I also am in political science and the Center for Political Studies. And I proposed that we start up a forum that thought a little bit more about sort of how AI was going to interact with society in various ways as ChatGPT and the like came online later last year. This is the second of the panels in that series, but we're hoping to continue doing them next year. The last one, which you can access on MIDAS's website, was on AI in the classroom and thinking about some of the implications of that. And we realized that one of the other really important places to think about this is when it comes to the role of AI in creativity. And so that is what this forum is about, where we're going to be thinking about and discussing issues related to AI composition and creativity and the kinds of societal issues that those will pose. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I just want to give a brief introduction to the Michigan Institute for Data Science. For those of you who don't know it, the Michigan Institute for Data Science is actually the largest data science institute at a university, at least in the United States, if not globally. We have a lot of affiliates from every school and college in the entire campus, as well as from the other campuses as well. We include faculty who are doing research related to the roles of AI in data science in either direct AI research, as ranging to applications of data science to the social sciences, research on what the implications might be of AI for the way that we live and work and other things of that sort. So if you haven't heard of us before, come learn about MIDAS. Feel free to become an affiliate if you are a faculty member. We would love to have you, and we promise we won't spam you with too many emails. It's only about once a week. But then let me turn it over to this as a forum. We thought if we're going to do AI and creativity, it actually makes a lot of sense to do it, not just sort of in the what we're talking about right now moment, but to think about it with the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and some of the issues that may not have been hashed out as much to date. And so we reached out to SMTD about being a co-sponsor of today's event, and they were quite enthusiastic about it. So today's panel, I'll briefly sort of give you a title for everybody, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of them a question during which they can sort of introduce themselves as well as provide an answer. That, as a whole, should take 15-ish minutes, and then we're going to turn over to a series of sort of general discussion questions, which will be another 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions, just so you know the basic arc for today. So first is Lu Wang, who's sitting to my right, who's an assistant professor of computer science and engineering in the College of Engineering. Michael Gurovich is an associate professor of music here in SMTD and does performing arts technology. Sarah Billman is the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the University Musical Society. And Jessica Littman is the John F. Nickel Professor of Law at the Law School. And so each of them are going to talk about, as you can imagine from their different roles, some different aspects of how this interplay of AI and composition and creativity really plays out. So I'm going to start with Professor Wang here. In recent years, output from AI models has increasingly come to look similar to human-generated products. What is it that led the products of these tools to seem so human?
Thank you, Josh. So basically, I think there are three fundamental things that would make them successful nowadays. The first thing that we probably all know and will discuss a lot is about the data, right? So where those models learn those knowledge, like text or image, right? So indeed, you probably heard of this. It's like, for example, ChatGPT style model. they're often trained on tens of terabytes of text data. And then for the DALL-E style model, they will be looking at maybe like hundreds of millions of images. And then the more recent Google model, Music LM, actually, they have to listen to like hundreds, thousands of hours of music, for example. So that's a lot of data. So the second pillar is basically you need to have a good architecture. So they have to be flexible, they have to be powerful, which is something which is not necessarily relevant here, but it's, the name is called transformer. So the good thing about it is like you can easily give a lot of parameters to such a model so that it will be super powerful and flexible to learn all this knowledge. And the third thing is actually how those models are trained. Basically how you teach those models to learn the knowledge in a data set, right? So you cannot just like, scan the data and then ultimately learn those things. One example is basically from language, right? So the models will be trained to learn to predict those words. Or the models can learn to predict the relations among different images, or the relation between images and their corresponding description. So if you think about that, after the model have been looking at so much data, it is totally possible they will learn the connections or the networks of different, say, linguist forms, or different pixels, or different notions, right? So then that's when we say they actually can acquire the meaning behind human language, or any creative arts here. So that's a not so brief answer, but hopefully that would give you some idea why they work so well.
Excellent. All right. So, Professor Gurevich, music and other creative compositions are designed to elicit more than mere content, but also to sort of convey meaning. How does the process of making meaning and interpreting meaning change as AI joins this process, either as a co-creator or actually as a sole composer?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one, and I'm going to answer it a little bit contrarily, if that's a word, because I think it's a good question because I think it reflects sort of the popular understanding of what music is and what music does. I would challenge it somewhat to say that music doesn't always explicitly convey meaning, or it's not always intended to convey meaning, and that it's not always intentional, right? There's not always an object that it's pointed toward. What I think music does is elicit meaning among listeners, right? So it evokes and it stimulates and it provokes. And so I think in that sense, I think that's an important way that we should frame our understanding of AI. And I mean that both positively and negatively, in the sense that I don't think that AI is currently or in the near future going to be successful at being able to understand the scope of influences and meanings that a composer or a performer will incorporate into a creative act. Because for now, AI systems and machine learning systems are focused mostly entirely on the surface and the structure and the content of the music itself, and not on all the social and cultural and intellectual other inputs that go into making music. On the other hand, I think AI will be very successful at eliciting and provoking meanings among listeners. As long as we understand what AI's role was in generating that, right? And so people who are using AI meaningfully now in making music, I think are doing it in ways that are really interesting, in that it sheds light on its failings, and in doing so sheds light on what's important and meaningful about music. So, there's a lot of people that are training machine learning on a corpus of well-known corpuses of like Irish folk music, for example, because these are things that are like very easily compartmentalizable, and the output is like, to a casual listener, plausibly Irish, and to an Irish folk musician is terrible, right? Because what the systems failed to do is to incorporate all of those things that go into the tradition, right? And so I think the music is successful in that way, and that it's provocative and it's interesting, and the ways that it fail are characteristic of the technology, in the same way that what's interesting about violin playing is the imperfections in a violin, which is characteristic of the technology of the violin. So in that way, I see both like the exciting potential of it, as long as we understand, you know, its limitations, but also the way that it's shedding light on what makes music so rich and powerful.
All right. And so, Professor Billman, are you a professor at all? Do you get, because you do teach, and I wasn't quite sure. I'm just trying to keep the titles consistent and not inadvertently detitle somebody. So in your role, sort of as somebody who really pays attention to audiences, we were interested in sort of as audiences who encounter compositions in the future are going to have this problem of trying to sort of determine where they come from, right? To contend with the fact that they don't know if it was created fully by people or what might have been aided or abetted by AI, as the case might be. And so how do we think about that from the perspective of consumers of media, as well as from the perspective of sort of those trying to evaluate it for society?
It's a really interesting question and dilemma, and I do love studying audiences and audience behavior and trying to figure out what makes people behave the way that they do. And I think this is not the first time we've encountered this problem. If you think about, when synthesizers and MIDI were first introduced, it was, oh my goodness, this is changing the sound of the classical orchestra, what have you. And certainly when you start to think about it from the standpoint of the visual arts, you had, works that are attributed to Rembrandt that were largely painted by his studio and not painted by Rembrandt. You think about the immersive Van Gogh experiences, which are definitely not Van Gogh, but trying to create some semblance of what that feeling might be. And, right now they've been really successful. I don't know how long that can last. In terms of something like an immersive Van Gogh, once somebody does that type of experience, will they actually go back? And I think what is unique about the performing arts field, at least, this is going to sound blasphemous to say it. There's no reason for anybody to attend a live performance just to hear the music. You can turn on Apple Music or Spotify or any recording and hear any piece of music you want in probably, 3 minutes. And the live experience still exists because there's something that people value about it that's intangible. Maybe it's a little bit towards the meaning making that you were talking about, but I think there's something about sharing that experience with a community and having that back and forth and that connection between the artist and the audience that is what makes it so potent. And whether something is created by somebody who died 200 years ago or somebody who's using other tools to help exist with that, if the performance is compelling and if the interpreter of the performance is actually making a case for it, audiences will be able to pick that up. There's a lot of music that isn't that great that's still performed, right? But people still enjoy the experience, and there's a whole lot of other stuff that comes into it. Making memories with family members and friends, being part of a collective experience, all of those things that are kind of the intangibles that I think is part of how people take account of the marketplace and decide whether they want to be part of it. That's my take at this point anyway. I'm not scared yet.
All right, and finally, Professor Lippman, when AI tools are used to create a novel composition, they're often drawing from existing pieces of art, existing compositions of various sorts that have artists of their own. And, this is particularly salient in yesterday's news or today's news, where there was a piece that mimicked Drake that became viral, but wasn't actually Drake. And so, how do we think about who the artist is there and how, how intellectual property works and copyrights in that kind of environment?
Okay. In copyright, we've got AI poses basically 3 problems. One is the output of an AI algorithm protected by copyright. 2, if an AI algorithm creates a song that sounds a lot like a Drake song, is that copyright infringement? And 3, is it copyright infringement to train AI algorithms on millions of different pieces written by real composers and songwriters? And the answers we have provisionally right now, all 3 of those questions are in litigation. We have cases pending challenging all of them, mostly in connection with the visual arts. But the Copyright Office has said that copyright protects human authorship, not authorship by elephants, orangutans, or machines. So if you create a work with the help of AI, copyright is going to protect what you added and is not going to protect what the computer algorithm added. And if you're registering a copyright, you need to disclose, I did this, the machine did this. Now that poses a pretty difficult question of how you separate out the human created expression and the machine created expression in the finished work. But that's the rule, however hard it is to apply, although a gentleman who created an algorithm who created a bunch of visual art is challenging that in court, saying he wants to own the copyright created by his algorithm, even though he didn't create the work. Second question, if an algorithm creates a work and it sounds a lot like a Drake song or anything else, how do we handle it? And that's one that's very easy for the copyright law. We handle it like everything else. We compare the 2 songs. If they are infringingly similar, then that's infringement whether they were created by a person or a computer program. The copyright statute doesn't actually care about intention when it's making that comparison. And it doesn't really care about responsibility to the extent the copyright owner has the exclusive right to perform that song publicly. Anyone who performs the infringing song created by an AI is going to be subject to copyright infringement liability. So the hard question is the training question. We're exposing computer programs to a ton of data, and that data includes letting the computer program see or hear works created by people that are protected by copyright. Now, the programs don't keep copies of those works. They note the relationships among the elements of those works, and then they move on to other works. On the other hand, people whose compositions are used in training the computer program are really pissed off at the possibility that someone will be able to write the sort of music they've been writing without being them and having lived through their experience. So that's the very hard question. In the context of data mining, we have basically decided that that kind of training is excused under the fair use privilege in the copyright statute. And, you know, it's also how we all learn what a piece of music is, by listening to bunches of them and at some level noting the relationships. On the other hand, it's an extremely emotionally fraught question. And so there are all sorts of lawsuits that have been brought in the last 12 months. And courts are going to have to figure out how to handle them. That's where we are.
I want to piggyback on that a bit. Is just, do you think the legal question and the ethical question are really divorced here, or do you think they're relatively similar? And maybe I should let anybody play on that one in the panel.
Yeah, I'll take that. I mean, yeah. So I think that's what I was kind of thinking as you're talking is I think they're different, right? Especially because we can look at the example of folk music that I just gave, right, where there can be an entire body of music that is in the public domain legally, right, works that are not under copyright because they either never were, copyright has expired, but I don't think that absolves a creator of considering the ethical implications of, for example, creating an AI-generated folk music, what they call an AI-generated folk music, tune based on a very, limited representation of what we would consider the music, right? These models are trained on some kind of symbolic representation of limited features of the music, right? Notes, maybe probably not dynamics, so we're just talking about kind of like ordered sets of pitches in time. For most part, most of these systems are trained on symbolic information, right? Which doesn't even come close to capturing the richness of like, I learned that tune from my teacher, whoever, who learned it from this person, and that person had moved from, stick with Ireland, from Galway to Belfast, and they took those characteristics of that music that they had taught, and then we're talking about someone who's then like abstracting away all of that richness of what makes that music meaningful to both the creators and the listeners, and then creating a work that's based on a very limited representation. So I think that and let's be frank, that the most likely situation where someone is going to be doing that is in a situation where they're going to want to, sell it rights free to a film score, probably, right? Or a TV commercial, right? So they're just basically monetizing it, abstracting away all of the richness of the music and the art so they can make a bit of money and not have to engage with that. And so I think that's where the ethical implications really come up. And I've been happy to see in the computer music community that researchers are actually directly starting to tackle that and to make increasingly journals and conferences in our field are requiring like ethical statements attached to papers for like, how did you consider the ethical implications of this? So I'm encouraged that this question is actually starting to bubble up, and it's because it's engaged in the real world too, which is where things get, I think, both messy but interesting.
So I don't disagree with you, but I think that ship has sailed. I think people are using AI to create cheap music for commercials and for film scores and so forth without any of that richness. I think that it's good that right now our view of the law is you can't get a copyright in that stuff, because to the extent one of the things we're worried about is that this is going to put musicians out of jobs the same way the recording industry and the synthesizer did. The limiting the incentives and the opportunities to monetize that music helps to damp that risk down a little bit.
So starting then, as AI tools become better at mirroring human compositions, is it reasonable to consider these works creative, or more fundamentally, sort of, when is it art and when isn't it?
So maybe I can start from a technical point of view, and then I will pass it to other experts from laws. So fundamentally, say computer scientists would think that those models are basically trying to learn the patterns from the data. So it's not, by definition, it doesn't sound creative at all, right? So basically what you learn and then you reflect that in output. For example, you probably all played around with ChatGPT. You got to see that, they seems to be like fluent, but if you look deeper and there's not much idea behind that, but it doesn't mean that there is no creativity at all. Because my feeling is, when we say something creative, usually there will be meaning behind those. We talk a lot about meaning, right? So we may find them meaningful, we may find them relevant and maybe interesting. So you feel like, oh, this is exciting, right? So it is totally possible for models to create something like that. For example, they can write a story we have never written before and with a good narrative arc in it, right? So this is totally possible. And then, but how creative or to which degree it can be creative all the time, then we will need, more systematic evaluation. For example, can those machineries repeat, this kind of like creation process? And can they actually create diverse content, not just like one type of things, right? My feeling is that if you say they're not creative at all, that's not fair, because we do see something, surprising and exciting come out of those, at least from the document generation point of view. But I can imagine there is a limitation so far, right? So there are other type of creative, like, products like, product design or, music, like composition, right? So all those things, that's actually, we do not see they're fully creative like yet, but I can imagine we will make some more progress. Yep.
Just a question, not fair to whom?
Good question. So, not fair to whom? I just feel like it's a understatement for how useful those models can be. Right? So it's not a binary decision like useful, useless, but rather we will see those models will be used in a lot of applications, so we cannot deny that. Actually, we have been using AI tools for many years, right? So it's just at this point, it becomes so amazing. So I guess it's a fair judgment for the technology's point of view, right? So we are reaching a point that they can be widely used in different applications and used as tools. Yeah, so that's the only degree that I would reach there.
I have thoughts, I guess. I guess it sort of ties back to what I said initially in the response to the first question, is I think that absolutely these systems and tools are creative. I think where we start to get into trouble is when we try to pass them off as being successful at imitating human creativity, right? So I think they're creative, and they're certainly creating things that are aesthetic, absolutely. But I think that the qualities of the system and their failures at imitating human creativity are what makes them aesthetic and what makes them artistically interesting, right? So, and this is not anything new, right? Like, I mean, I think Marcel Duchamp sort of settled this: can an industrially produced object be a piece of art? Absolutely. We've sort of known that for well over 100 years. Once we start to consider what are the aesthetics of machine-produced music or any machine-produced art, I think that's where it becomes interesting, right? So it's like, what is post-digital art? It's the aesthetics of it are the particular qualities of the digital systems that are creating them. And I think that where they fail at imitating human creativity is in those failures, right? What makes human-made art interesting is that the way we break the rules are sort of consistent. We develop consistent styles, and as far as I've seen, AI systems are not good at. They're good at imitating certain features of human styles, but they're not good at creating their own styles. So they don't have their own kind of inherent patterns of failure that we can say, oh, that sounds like Bob AI versus like that sounds like Jane AI, But that's what makes like Dexter Gordon different than John Coltrane, right? Is like those little subtleties. And so I think that, like an AI that can imitate Drake is like great, but an AI I think still can't be its own Drake. So I think that's where, but that doesn't make the outputs of these systems uninteresting to me as art. I mean, I think they're really fascinating. And I'll just point out like that musicians and artists like since probably before Duchamp have been doing this and playing with this, There's like trying to think of a good example, but so, what's his name? There's an artist that took, so, like MP3 encoding tries to, like limit the data size of a digital audio file or digital audio representation by hiding all the things we can't hear in it, right? And encoding those poorly. So artists have said, well, that's cool. What if we just take all the residuals of what MP3 like tries to encode out and make art and music out of that? And what does that sound like? The stuff that we're not supposed to hear that we can imagine we can't hear. And so like, I think that's where post-digital art gets really interesting. And I think that and this is where I think the concerns of people in SMTD, which is like an environment that's supposed to be like advancing and advocating for experimental art, is like, we have the luxury of doing that, right? So that's where my concerns really differ from, as like an artist, really differ from someone who, wants to make money selling music. So.
Well, and I was just going to tag on to that too, and you started to allude to it, I think, is that the creative composition is also so dependent on the interpretation of it. And I think it's going to actually be really interesting to see how performers deal with AI-generated music or assisted music, however you want to describe it, because we've certainly all been in a situation where you can hear somebody, hack their way through an incredible piece of music and it's not really that exciting, or you can hear a true master interpreter who has spent hours and hours and hours practicing and honing their craft and performing it, and it becomes absolutely revelatory. You think about, the trope of the parent going into an art museum and seeing Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko and saying, oh, my kid could do that. But they don't, and they haven't. And if they tried, it wouldn't look anything like that. So I still think there's something in there about the interpretation above and beyond the creation that is what makes the music or the creation meaningful.
So I guess I think creativity is a word with many meanings. And in our different disciplines, we may use it to mean other things. And if we're asking from the point of view of the work, is this new? Has it never existed before? We get to one answer. And if we're asking about the generative process that the person who created it engaged in, we get another answer. And to the extent this is poised on the border of many of those meanings, it probably invites us to think about what we mean by creativity. But I don't think we're all talking about the same thing when we ask whether an AI algorithm who composes music is engaging in a creative act, or whether the piece of music is creative.
So, when we're dealing with this, when individuals are working with AI or heck, increasingly in various different areas, when AI is generating things of its own ilk without really much directional impression from people, how do we think about the provenance of the authorship there, right? How do we think of like, who is the author of this and why? And I recognize, like, from a copyright perspective, we may say there's not a copyright way that we're going to assign authorship here, right? So we've learned today, but it's still interesting to think, what does it mean to think of authorship there, and where it comes from and how we attribute it? Any thoughts there?
Well, I was saying to you before this conversation that when Josh first asked me to join the panel, we were having an internal dilemma at UMS because we had a piece that was very difficult to describe, just performed a few days ago, actually. And there wasn't a lot of information about it or the composer that was readily available. So we decided to do a blog post for it, and our director of digital media just, write a blog post of about 300 words that describes the impact and importance of this work. It was pretty good. It wasn't great. I mean, it wasn't brilliant writing, but it got to the essence and for something that we were using to introduce audiences. And he came into my office and he said, I don't know if we should publish this. It's kind of scary. And, you know, talking to the legal and ethical implications of it, you know, he said, I don't know what we should do with this. And so we talked it through and I said, well, first thing, let's, you know, take a couple of sentences and run it through and make sure it's not plagiarizing to get to the legal implications. But we ended up deciding that ethically what we were trying to do, as long as we were straightforward about it, and actually the very first line of the post said this post was, you know, largely written by an AI tool that pulled together a lot of disparate sources to describe it. So we were very upfront about that. This is so early on, I think that's still going to feel more normal. 6 months, a year, 18 months from now, I don't know if that's going to still be the case. But I think right now there's definitely that kind of fear of getting caught as passing something off as your own that isn't. And so right now it feels like people are being more cautious about that.
All right. So I think we've sort of danced around a little bit this question of AI learning a style, right? And in particular, the Drake example, I think is going to come up because it is literally yesterday's news, right? This notion of AI learns the style of a particular person or a particular set of people, as the case may be. The product of that. I mean, apparently in one legal case, it's being considered a copyright violation. It's not clear it would always have any of the same notes as no? Am I misunderstanding? I know they're taking it down.
Nothing is settled yet.
Okay.
There are lawsuits, and at least right now, the digital platforms are going to take it down, which is why, although it was there a few days ago, you can't find it anymore because the record label said, no, this infringes our rights. All of the ways that it's similar are not protected by copyright. So Drake doesn't have a copyright in his voice. And so being able to sing like Drake is something that at least right now the copyright statute doesn't protect. There are other statutes out there that protect it to the extent you're fooling someone into believing this is Drake. That's oddly enough a trademark law violation. Drake has some rights of publicity that cover his voice. And so a song doesn't have to have the same notes in order to be infringing the copyright. But indeed, we would need two juries really to listen to the two songs and decide whether or not they were similar enough to invade the rights that copyright gives Drake in his song. And that's always been a fact-specific kind of thing, and this makes copyright infringement litigation really expensive.
I'm hopeful that one outcome of this is that it's gonna maybe force musicians, record labels to get a little better at what they do. Because I mean, honestly, like the reason it's so easy to copy pop music that is commercially successful is that largely there's not much to it. I mean, to be blunt. And so I think that yeah, I'm serious. Like, I'm genuinely optimistic that the style characteristics of certain, types of music are just, they're really not that complex. So I think that it might nudge musicians to introducing more complexity into their styles. Because if it's really that easy for machine learning to model them, then I think that's where we're running into issues. So I think there's that aspect to it, and I think I would just point out that this isn't a new question. So there was like a famous case in music in the 1990s. A researcher named David Cope did models of input all of Bach into actually fairly now by our standards like really simplistic machine learning system, generated a bunch of outcomes from it and cherry picked what were the best ones and then presented them to a musicology or music theory conference as like an undiscovered Bach work, and everyone bought it. And this was in the 90s, and those experiments started in the 50s actually. The first kind of recognized AI music composition was in the early 1950s at the University of Illinois using the ILLIAC computer, if anyone knows that history of computing, and it was called the ILLIAC suite. And the outputs are kind of interesting. And so I think, like, again, we're sort of like, think of the extremes. The outcomes of that are interesting because they don't really sound like anyone. And the ones that sound a lot like someone whose music isn't that interesting to start with is like, I guess, so what, is kind of my take on it. I think the question of things that are digesting huge volumes of music and then spitting out things that are really novel is more thorny, because it's like, do all of the owners of those individual little bits of music that went into making that, what is their kind of like, how are their stake represented? And I don't have a good answer to that. I think maybe a data scientist does.
I actually have a question based on those. Seems like we talk a lot about the similarity between the styles, for example, by some musician versus what's produced by AI. But I'm curious that what if, let's say, the model is trained on a lot of people's like work, right? And then if, let's say, they're smart people, they design algorithms, and then I produce things like I on purpose design it not to be similar to any of those people, or I figure out a way how you measure the similarity, and then I just try to hack it. I try to be a adversary here, right? So how do we judge that then? So clearly it's trained on a couple of people's work, and clearly it's trying to mimic the patterns in it. But just because I figured out a way to get around the criterion you're using to judge whether that's a plagiarism or whatever, and then how should we think about that then?
So I can give you the legal rule that's not the aesthetic rule or the moral rule or the policy rule. If we're looking legally at the output, then we're comparing the two works to see how similar they are. And if they're not similar, then as far as copyright law is concerned, you haven't taken anything from any particular composer. If they are similar, even if it's an accident, probably that will end up being actionable if they're similar enough. If you would buy this song rather than that song, you don't care, they sound the same to you. What people are arguing is that the act of training itself, the act of exposing the computer to the works, is itself infringement, because computers can't hear. In order for computers to be exposed to music, we need to make a digital copy of the music and feed it to the computer. And what people are arguing is making that copy that we then feed to the computer that it analyzes and forgets. That's the copyright infringement. That's the argument. I think as a copyright lawyer that if we go down that road, that way lies madness, that there are too many that if we require permission anytime anything touches digital technology, we just come to a gridlocked world over all kinds of art. But that copy, even though it isn't retained, is the hook to connect a 60-year-old copyright law to a 21st century problem.
So first question, come on down.
Hi. So my question is regarding the legality mainly. Like the thing that comes to mind is LimeWire, and how while that was illegal eventually, when it came out, the law was not ready for it. And it was kind of a Pandora's box of like, even though eventually the laws were like, oh, you can't just do that. By that point, the entire industry started to shift towards streaming and that kind of thing. And it kind of seems like now, like we already have a song that came out yesterday that fooled the internet. So like while this is being debated in courts, like whoever made that software could also make, a Michael Jackson song and a Beatles song and like, entire albums and catalogs to work off of. And then it's like, how do you deal with it past that point?
So making copyright law is slow. Nobody's trying to do that. What they're trying to do is argue that LimeWire was always illegal under the law that was enacted in 1976. And whenever something is new, as today AI is new, you're going to have arguments about how the old familiar barnacle-encrusted rules apply to this new thing. And because the court process is slow, it may take 7 years to get a definitive answer. But Congress is certainly not going off and trying to pass a law against LimeWire. LimeWire and Napster and everybody else got shut down on the basis of laws that were enacted before their founders were born.
Hello, I have a question for you. What is the difference between sampling and AI?
Well, I mean, AI right now is reminding me very much of all of the debates we had when sampling was new. Because you have some people who were saying, oh, it's a little bit, that's fine. And some people who were saying in sampling, I don't want my voice in there, in that piece of music with all that swearing and all that stuff I don't approve of. And people are feeling the same emotional connection. They're similar issues. If you're talking about sampling by AI, I don't know that it's any different, but I think how we think about them is really pretty similar. So, I mean, can you be a little more specific than sampling AI legally?
Well, where I'm going with this is, thank you. Where I'm going with this, is there a point where AI gets so refined and so sophisticated that it actually is preferable over humans?
To whom? Right? Michael's going to say no.
I think there are a lot of cases AI's products are already preferred by human. And then because, for example, like I do research in language generation, that's exactly what ChatGPT is doing so well, right? So sometimes when we have to do study, right? So we have to evaluate, our system outcome. And then when you show this is a human written text and this is a machine written text, and sometimes human can't tell the difference. And then they sometimes even say the machine written text is better in terms of, say, fluency, because we tend to have typos, grammar errors, right? So, and sometimes because the models have learned so much from the data set, they are actually good at memorizing a lot of things better than humans. So it's, in some degree, right, machines are made doing better in some aspects, actually. Yeah. But of course, not all of them. Yep.
This isn't a direct answer, but I think it's interesting if we look at the trajectory. Obviously, the music industry embraced sampling eventually, and I think maybe a difference here is that the music industry embraced sampling because they realized, because the music industry at the time was really run by a bunch of, a really small number of stakeholders. It was very monopolized. That they could still make money, right? So like, because, you're just licensing my sample, so we're both gonna make money off the deal. So it kind of worked out for everyone. I think in this case, it's a little bit different because the music industry has become so decentralized that the power dynamics are a little bit different in that, like, I think even in the case of sampling, where sampling becomes thorny is when someone is sampling the music of someone who isn't signed by a major label and they can just lawyer their way out of like actually compensating them. But I think if the Drakes of the world were smart, they would embrace this and not, fight it, because that's what, if you look at sampling, that's what they figured out is like, if I just embrace people sampling my music and not just like fight it, but actually embrace it and make that part of my artistic identity, as as all of the musicians who ever been sampled eventually did, it works out for everyone. And I think like Drake on stage performing with his AI avatar would be really cool, much cooler than a lot of other things.
Just a note of caution, I don't think the music industry embraced sampling until there was a price.
I constantly use for my students, actually in communication, this wonderful moment where Vanilla Ice was trying to defend not putting I'm forgetting who the person he sampled from, or no, not putting the Queen as a co-writer of Ice Ice Baby on MTV. And I remember functionally it didn't really matter for him, but he just looked like a complete jerk. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of social sanction answer to any of this that any of you expect to see. Because, I mean, for my students, it was the example of, if you plagiarize stuff, you just look like a jerk, right? But I think there is this larger social story that can be part of it. And I'm wondering if any of you see that in this. Or not really. No, not necessarily.
I don't want to talk too much. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like along the lines of what I was saying, right? Yeah.
So I was sort of listening to a lot of different questions as I was listening, but one of the ones I started to think about was how we're viewing these pieces of art as the art, when in reality I think we should possibly be viewing the software as the art and all of its outputs. I'm wondering, is it possible that we could reframe the argument a little bit and say, okay, the art is everything generated by these different proprietary pieces of software that are owned by companies, and every input has an output. So yes, there's going to be infinite pieces of art from one company. I'm wondering who's responsible. Is it the company? Is it the people who input the data? Who's responsible in this situation?
So I'm going to ask you what you mean by responsible. I mean, yes, the company that creates the algorithm certainly owns rights in the algorithm and will be liable if the algorithm takes down the power grid. If the company itself is doing all of the inputs, then it's still the entity that's doing that. But if it releases it to the public and says, play, you give it inputs, that's where it gets a little complicated. There will be people whose careers will be generating the right prompt to get the result you want from particular kinds of AI algorithms. There will someday, I expect, be AI algorithms whose specialty is talking to other AI algorithms to get the song that sounds like Drake. But once there's more than one entity, then it's hard to separate out who's responsible for the different pieces.
So the question is, if a person were to produce the input and get the output from an algorithm, do they own that output?
Right now, no. Right now, nobody in particular owns the output. What the person who creates the input owns is the input. And that's what the person who creates the input owns.
Is there basis in court when Drake challenges an output that nobody owns? Just remember, we're trying to record for posterity.
So if nobody owns the output, it's still possible to take it down. You can still be legally responsible for playing it. You just don't, it's not necessarily your property. But as I said, all of this is, I mean, we're talking about lawsuits that have been filed within the last 12 months. So they're not going to be decided probably until, say, 2030, because that's how long it takes.
All right, I think one last question from the audience, or actually we have two that have been sitting here, so I'm gonna let you both go. But yeah. So I think just these two have been.
Thank you. So I wonder, like, can AI actually like create a brand new style, which can be like very successful in the future? So from a very biased like data science perspective, since we already have the data of like how composer A learn from composer B and grow like have composer C, so we have this type of data there, and we are probably able to train those data to like create those kind of new style. So but it seems like currently the current AI can only like produce something like average human being can do, especially from the art scenario. So I wonder, like, what is the gap there, like from the technical aspect and also from the meaning production aspect?
So I think that's a very good point from technical point of view. You're right, because the models are basically just looking at this data and then do what is the most likely to happen, and then is good to say it's probably just an average human, right? So, and then if you see the data from X more, then you will be more like X. And then if you see Y fewer, then probably less like a Y. But it doesn't mean that the model doesn't acquire anything from Y, right? So, and then indeed, it's a research question how we can actually create a Z that doesn't exist in the data set. And then that's a classic extrapolation problem for machine learning, and people are making progress, but I feel like this is again subjective, like we have been talking about, right? What does it mean by this is a new thing? What does it mean by this is actually Z, different from X and Y, right? So if we do not have a measurement or a way to judge whether it's new, I don't see how to address that question properly, actually. Yeah, but I think that's a totally legit concern. Yeah, that's just technical point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that in order to be more successful, we will need to figure out ways to incorporate somehow more data than what's represented in the music itself, because I think that's a large part of what makes music meaningful, and that's really where I think we're still very much in the Wild West, because it's really hard to describe the range of influences that are impacting on a particular composer or performer that they're incorporating when they're making, you know, a piece of art. And it's easy to find patterns in their output, right? But it's much harder to connect those to extra musical influences or things that are outside of the domain that you're considering. And I think that's important also because that's what's meaningful for people too, for listeners, right? So, you know, a particular piece of music may have a resonance with me, not just because of the features of the music itself, but because of like the bassist in the band did a collaboration with someone who was my favorite artist when I was 13 and I broke up with my first girlfriend. And, you know, but those are all of the things that incorporate into our experience of listening to a piece of music, right? And those things are really hard to capture in AI because those are also the kinds of things that are impacting on creators too. So I don't think we have I think we're far away from having good answers for that. But I think once we can start to do that, it becomes more conceivable that an AI is going to develop its own stylistic characteristics if we could sort of train it on a particular set of data that incorporates a lot of stuff outside of music. So right now, AI music systems are much better when they're trained on very small data relatively, right? So if you train something on all of like Western classical music, it's going to create average Western classical music, right? But if you train it on like Detroit techno, which is really easily kind of circumscribed, it's much more plausible that it's going to create something that sounds like Detroit techno and sounds plausibly like Detroit techno because it's not considering a bunch of things that are going to also distract it, right? So that's, I think, a bit of the dilemma. Because once you start growing and growing the size of the training data, it's going to just have that kind of averaging effect unless you start to, I think, in my opinion, kind of like bring in those extra musical features somehow. What's that?
Regression to the mean.
Right, yeah.
All right, last one.
Okay, so the previous question kind of led a bit into this actually, which was essentially like with all these large language models and with like the emergence of this machine learning and AI technology, we see like a higher emphasis and higher value placed on things that are original and products that have their own like particular value, and we value the interpretation, which we were talking about before, of like music, for example. And so with this like individuality, I would say, how do you think that this emphasis on individuality is going to affect like the way we teach, in the way that we write emails, in the way that we, like even something that I can think about is I went to a talk recently on how AI is being used in a preliminary study to like generate medical documents when you're talking, like a patient talks to a doctor. And so with all these like almost repetitive tasks, we see that that's the primary use of machine learning and AI. So how exactly is this going to affect our education? Do you guys feel, and perhaps maybe in your respective fields, how exactly this is going to influence us?
Well, it's a great question. You know, I think right now everything feels like the Wild West, and so it feels very threatening. This may not answer your question completely, but I'm thinking about two things like virtual reality systems a few years ago, and certainly in the arts world that was to a certain degree viewed as a threat. But now I was just reading about a theater company in Finland that's actually been taking advantage of these tools to look at what a set is going to, to help create the set in a cost-effective way that's kind of identifying problems before they get to the point of building it. And so they're able to embrace the tools and figure out how to make it work for them. That's not really getting at the individuality question. And I think frankly, I think that's part of what makes art, is that there is that individual focus that speaks to people on a personal level. But I think that right now this all just feels really scary and murky, and nobody really knows what to do with it. My guess is that it's going to end up creating a completely different marketplace and a completely different kind of group of people who are interested in this kind of, whether you want to call it art or creativity or what have you, but that it's going to speak to a different group of people than some of the things that may be out there already, and that rather than cutting into the pie, it's just going to expand it.
Thanks for that question. I think one of the things it provokes for me is recalling that music is a social activity. Fundamentally, that's what music is, right? And that's, probably historically the roots of music is social cohesion, right? And so I think it exposes, like our discussion here exposes like a Eurocentric bias of how we tend to conceive of music as a product of individual authorship, right? And in much of the world, the way music is practiced is much more socially than we are talking about music today. So I think it's just an example of how, you know, our legal framework, our cultural framework is sort of like predicated on these notions of making it easy to attribute authorship for like financial compensation. So I think that if we bear that in mind, then I think AI seems a lot less threatening because it's much less plausible that AI is going to, and it's much more difficult to think about how AI is going to inject itself into the social practice of music making, which includes listening. And so I think like that it also by the same token becomes really interesting to think about what does the social practice of music making become when there are AI elements into it. So, and that's actually kind of what my own interest is it's like, how do we perform with machines as co-performers, as co-creators in the moment for what we're doing? And it's a lot harder to think about, I think, because it's much easier to do the kinds of things we're talking about, training big data that's been recorded and notated. But I think what's going to happen is that for us in the short term is it's going to, I think, really call into relief the social practice of music making. And I think, as Sarah said, I think like very early on is that's the reason we go to live music, right? And it's the reason we go to concerts is for that social experience. So I think that that's not going to change and that's not going to go away.
On that possibly quite hopeful note, can everybody thank the panelists and thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate the support from MIDAS and the School of Music, Theater, and Dance for putting this on. If you want to find out more about this and other things that we do, both go to the MIDAS website, which is midas.umich.edu, and the AI in Society series is on there, and we will continue to host more stuff in the future. Yeah, MIDAS. Yes, hope to see you at stuff in the future, and thank you all for coming out.